A boy has been living the same day for 3,000 years, 900,000 dawns, 900,000 deaths, and tonight, for the first time, the sun will not reset him. It started the way every disaster starts, quietly and then all at once. 5 years ago, cracks split open across the sky in 43 countries simultaneously. Not explosions, not meteors, tears. Thin silver lines that hung in the air like scars on the world's skin, and then widened into gates. The scientists called them rifts. The religious called them punishment. The rest of the world just called them the end. Out of the rifts came monsters that shouldn't exist. Creatures built from nightmare logic. Things with too many eyes or not enough mouths. Beasts that moved like they'd been assembled from other, worse animals. And alongside the monsters came something else. Power. A fraction of humanity, one in every few thousand, woke up one morning with abilities no physics textbook could explain. They called themselves Reapers. The world called them humanity's only chance. Kale Soul was not one of the strong ones. Not at first. He was 19 when his neighborhood's designated response team got called into a C-rank rift that had opened under a shopping district, and he was drafted along with 6 others because the government's mandatory service law didn't care whether you were ready. He remembers the smell of that rift more than anything. Wet stone and ozone, like a basement after a lightning storm. He remembers his team leader, a woman named Yun-hee who used to hum old pop songs under her breath before every fight, pushing him behind her the moment the Ashclaw worm dropped from the ceiling. He remembers all 6 of them dying to buy him 30 seconds. He remembers running. And he remembers, more than anything else, the exact texture of the dawn light through the rift's shattered ceiling. Orange, dust-thick, indifferent. Right before the world reset around him and he woke up in his apartment as if none of it had happened, Yun-hee's numbers still saved in his phone, her voicemail still unheard, and the Rift mission notice blinking fresh on his terminal like it was the first time. It was not the first time. It would not be the last. By the time Kale escaped the loop, he had died in that rift 2,847 times. He had died to the worm. He had died to the collapsing ceiling. He had died running, died hiding, died trying to be a hero on day 400, and died being a coward on day 600, because eventually you run out of ways to be afraid and start experimenting instead. Somewhere around year 200, dying stopped being the hard part. Understanding stopped being the hard part too. He learned the worm's attack patterns down to the half-second. He learned which support beams in the shopping district would hold and which would not. He learned, eventually, that the loop wasn't punishing him. It was teaching him, whether he wanted the lesson or not. So he studied. Not just the rift, everything. 3,000 years is a strange unit of time to hold in a body that's aged maybe 400 days externally, long enough that Kale forgot what his own laugh sounded like before the loop began. Long enough that he'd cycled through obsessions the way other people cycle through weekends. A decade of martial arts manuals downloaded onto a cracked phone he found in a dead soldier's pocket. A decade of medical textbooks memorized in a looted pharmacy basement while monsters screamed somewhere above him. A decade spent doing nothing but running numbers on Rift energy signatures until the mathematics of the system started to feel less like a curse and more like a language he was finally learning to read. He learned to perform field surgery with steadier hands than most trauma surgeons because he had 400 years of unlimited practice and unlimited patience who would be alive again tomorrow regardless of what he did wrong tonight. He learned languages because there was nothing else to do during the 6-hour stretches when the Rift's monster spawns went quiet. He learned to hack because a bored engineer trapped in a cycle with nothing but time eventually cracks every system she gets curious about, and Kale had been that engineer for longer than most nations have existed. He learned, near the end, that the worm wasn't the real boss of that rift at all. It was a decoy. The actual seed of the C-rank rift was buried 9 floors down, in a chamber that only opened if you solved a puzzle the loop had never once shown him a hint for, because in 2,846 attempts, he had never once survived long enough, or been curious enough at the right dying moment, to look for it. On the 2,847th dawn, he found it. The chamber was small, a single pedestal, a single dark stone pulsing with a slow, tired light, like something that had been waiting a very long time to stop being alone. Kale remembers picking it up and thinking, with the flat exhaustion of a man who has thought everything already. If this doesn't work, I'll just do it again tomorrow. The dawn didn't come. He stood in that chamber for what felt like an hour before he understood, really understood, that the loop had broken. That whatever mechanism reset him at sunrise every single time had, for the first time in 3,000 years, simply not fired. He walked out of the rift into a city that had aged 5 years while he'd relived one day 900,000 times. His apartment key still worked. That detail almost broke him more than the silence did. The mundane, absurd fact that a 5-year-old key still turned in a lock, that his refrigerator still hummed the same broken hum, that a coffee mug he'd left in the sink on the worst morning of his life was still sitting there, dust-rimmed, exactly where he'd set it down before the world ended and started ending again and again and again. He sat on the edge of his bed and opened the interface that had haunted 3,000 years of his life. The status panel he'd learned to read the way other people read their own heartbeat. Level 9. That's what it told him. Class unassigned. And beside it, an error message where his experience value should have been. The system simply couldn't display a number large enough to hold 3,000 years of accumulated learning. Level 9. After 3,000 years, the system still only credited him for the handful of real, linear days he'd lived. All those centuries of dying and learning, and dying again, had sharpened his mind into something that didn't belong in a Level 9 body, and the disconnect between what he knew and what he could officially do sat in his chest like a held breath. On the desk beside his bed sat the only physical thing he'd carried out of the loop with him, an egg, dull gray, faintly warm, dropped by something he'd only managed to kill twice in 3,000 years and had learned, on the second kill, to preserve instead of simply harvest. He didn't know what it would become. He'd never lived long enough after killing that thing to find out. The door slammed open. "You absolute, where have you been?" His sister, Mira. In a wheelchair she'd been in since the car accident that took their parents 4 years before the rifts even opened. An accident that had nothing to do with monsters, that was simply the ordinary tragedy the universe hands out before it starts handing out extraordinary ones. She'd told him once, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and fear, that she'd live enough for both of them. He'd promised her, in the same room, that he'd get her back on her feet no matter what it took. He hadn't kept that promise yet, but he had 3,000 years of surgical knowledge sitting unused in his skull now, and for the first time since that hospital room, the promise felt like something with an actual shape. "I missed you," he said, and meant it with a weight she couldn't possibly understand, and pulled her into a hug that made her sputter and complain that he was being weird, that he'd only been gone a day. Why was he acting like this? A day, he thought. Right. The television was on in the kitchen while she reheated dinner and yelled at him for making her worry. A news anchor's calm, professional voice was narrating footage of a man in white gold armor pulling survivors from rubble, his expression serene, almost holy. Warden Asher Vale, leader of the Sentinel Order, once again confirmed today as humanity's strongest reaper, continuing his campaign of rift purification across the eastern corridor. Kale's jaw tightened. He knew Asher Vale. Not the way the cameras knew him, not the saint, not the golden savior with a jaw like it had been carved for propaganda posters. Kale knew him the way you know the exact shape of a knife that's been in your back 900,000 times. In one loop, buried somewhere in the low 3,000s, he'd wandered off the beaten path of his usual C-rank grind and stumbled into a rift collapse event 3 states over. A rare enough occurrence that it had taken him nearly 200 repeat cycles just to find the right conditions to witness it again. What he'd seen, hidden behind a half-collapsed wall while an entire raid team screamed and died around him, was Asher Vale, dying. Genuinely, catastrophically dying, gutted by something that outclassed him completely. And then not dying, because Asher Vale had reached into the dying bodies of his own teammates, the people who trusted him, who'd bled beside him, and taken something out of them. Something Kale still didn't have a clean word for. He'd watched a man devour 11 of his own allies to survive a wound that should have killed him, watched the Golden Savior walk out of that rift alone, smiling for the cameras an hour later like nothing at all had happened. The world called him a hero because the world had never seen what Kale had seen. And Kale, level 9, 3 days back from 3,000 years underground, could not do a single thing about it yet. Not yet, he thought. watching the golden man's face fill the screen. But I know what you are. And I have all the time in the world to become someone who can end you. He almost laughed at himself. He didn't technically have all the time in the world anymore. That was rather the point. Mira called him to dinner before his thoughts could spiral further, and he let them. Later that night, alone at his desk, he opened his interface again and stared at the long list of skills he'd accumulated. Some real, system-granted powers earned from 3,000 years of grinding the same handful of rifts over and over. Most of them useless novelties. The kind of things a bored, immortal man teaches himself out of sheer desperate curiosity. Surgery. 6 languages. Enough hacking knowledge to make a state intelligence agency nervous. A frankly absurd amount of competitive chess theory he'd never once had the chance to use against another human being. None of it mattered if he stayed at level 9. He thought about the people he remembered from those 3,000 years. Not memories exactly, more like echoes, faces glimpsed across 100 different timelines that had never quite lined up into the same present. A girl with a psychic gift she didn't know how to control, who he'd once talked out of a gang war in a version of this city that no longer technically existed. A boy who carried something monstrous inside him and was terrified of what he might become. An assassin who owed him a debt she'd never admit to. A brilliant, furious woman running a research empire she'd built to save the world, one equation at a time. None of them remembered him. Of course they didn't. Those versions of them had died with their timelines, over and over, resetting into strangers each dawn. But he remembered them. Every version, every face, every small kindness or cruelty across 3,000 years of watching people live and die, in loops they didn't know they were trapped in. He was going to find them again, all of them. And this time, he wasn't going to let a single one of them die to buy him 30 seconds. He picked up the gray egg from his desk, turned it over once in his palm, and set it carefully on the windowsill, where the first real dawn he'd earned in 3,000 years was just beginning to break. 10 days, he murmured to the empty room, running the numbers he'd half memorized from a stray system notification the moment he'd stepped out of the loop. A forced catastrophe-grade rift event. Incoming, mandatory, no way to opt out. 10 days until the next disaster that no version of him had ever survived clean. 10 days to build something the old loops never let him build. A team that would live past dawn. He opened the guild registration terminal on his desk, hands steady from 3,000 years of steadier things, and began to type the guild's name. Last dawn, the Reaper Registration Center smelled like every government building Kale had ever hated across every timeline. Floor polish and bureaucracy, and the particular boredom of people who process disasters for a living. He walked to the counter with the calm of a man who had queued for exactly this desk 900 separate times across 900 different loops, back when he'd needed information more than registration. "I'd like to register a guild," he said. The clerk, a young woman with a Sentinel Order pin on her lapel, and the polite exhaustion of someone who fielded this request weekly, glanced at his profile on her screen. Her expression shifted, subtly, into the specific pity reserved for people about to be told something they already half suspect. "Level 9, she said. "Sir, guild founders typically clear at least level 40, usually with A-rank clearance from at least one prior rift. I can put you on a waiting list for—" "I have an item," Kale said, and set the gray egg gently on the counter. The scanner light swept over it, and for a moment nothing happened. Then the terminal screen behind the clerk lit up red, then gold, then a color that made 2 other clerks at nearby desks stop what they were doing entirely. "That's," the woman started, and then stopped, and then started again in a completely different tone. "That's an S-class relic signature. Sir, where did you—" "It needs to be kept below 0 degrees Celsius, Kale said, ignoring the question with the ease of a man who'd fielded it in his head 900 times before it was ever asked. "It's not fully classified yet. Treat it as fragile." The clerk processed the registration with hands that had gone slightly unsteady, murmuring the fine print out of habit more than necessity. 36 hours, 3 members minimum, deposit forfeit on failure. Kale listened, nodded, and pulled out his phone the moment the guild ID pinged into existence on his account. The registration confirmed on his screen. Last dawn, founder Kale Soul, 1 member out of the required 3, 36 hours remaining on the clock. He sent 4 invitations before he'd even left the building. 4 names pulled from 3,000 years of half-remembered timelines. 4 people who, in this real, unlooped present, had no idea who he was. He was going to change that. The first invitation went to a boy training kendo in a dojo 2 cities over. A boy Kale remembered dying on day 4100 of a loop 3 years further along than this one, always too proud to ask for help. The second went to a woman running a biotech firm's afternoon meeting who would, in every timeline Kale had ever glimpsed her in, call the request boring and mean it for exactly 4 hours before her curiosity got the better of her. The third went to a soldier standing guard on a supply convoy who'd once, in a loop Kale barely remembered, saved a child's life, and then spent the rest of that particular cycle pretending it hadn't mattered to him. The fourth went to a girl he hadn't met yet in this timeline at all. A girl with a temper like a struck match, running a small crew of nobodies in an alley 3 blocks from where Kale himself had once bled out on day 1200, back when he still thought dying was the worst thing that could happen to him. 3 rejections came back within the hour. Kale smiled, tired and unsurprised, and started walking toward the alley anyway. He had 35 hours left. He had 3,000 years of knowing exactly how stubborn this particular girl was going to be. He had, for the first time in longer than he could properly measure, a morning that was actually going to lead somewhere. The alley smelled like rust and rain-soaked cardboard, tucked behind a row of shuttered noodle shops in the district everyone politely called transitional and impolitely called something else. Kale turned the corner just in time to watch 3 men go flying. "You think you can walk into my corner and shake me down?" A woman's voice snapped, sharp enough to cut glass. "I built this block from nothing. I bled for it. You want a piece? You're going to bleed for it too." A fourth man raised a pistol, fired 3 times. The bullets stopped mid-air, hung there, quivering, like the world had put them on pause, and then reversed, screaming back the way they'd come. The gunman didn't even have time to look surprised before all 3 rounds punched through his shoulder and he went down screaming. Kale watched from the mouth of the alley, arms crossed, a small and unreasonable smile tugging at his mouth. Some things, apparently, didn't change no matter how many timelines you cycled through. Shia Vance had always had a flair for the dramatic. She turned toward him the second the last man hit the ground, chest heaving, dark eyes narrowed, and searching for the next threat. "Who the hell are you?" "Kale Soul," he said. "I came to invite you to a guild." For a second she just stared. Then she laughed, a short, ugly bark of a laugh. The kind that meant, this is either a joke or an insult and I haven't decided which yet. Her men, what was left of them upright, started snickering along with her. "A level 9 wants to recruit me?" She looked him up and down, unimpressed. "Sweetheart, I could snap you like a toothpick." "Prove it," Kale said, and stepped forward, and drove a single straight punch into the wall 6 feet to her left. The wall didn't just crack, it evaporated. A 6-foot radius of brick and mortar turned to dust, and flying shrapnel, the shockwave rattling every window on the block. Somewhere behind Shia, one of her men actually sat down on the ground, as if his legs had simply decided that standing was no longer worth the risk. Shia's eyes went very wide, very fast. "Repetition," Kale said mildly, like he was explaining a recipe. "Do the same motion enough times, and I mean enough, not gym rat enough, and even a level 9 punch can do that." She recovered fast. He'd give her that, she always recovered fast, and answered with a burst of raw psychic force, debris, and loose bullets alike, screaming toward him in a wall of violent momentum. Kale slid sideways through the gap she hadn't meant to leave, appeared behind her before the debris even finished falling, and said, conversationally, "You're too slow." "Cheap trick," she snarled, spinning to face him. "Fine," Kale said. "No physical strikes, psychic only. Rows of cans, over there. Whoever knocks down more, wins." She grinned like a shark smelling blood in the water and unleashed a burst that scattered the entire row in a single violent gust, cans flying, clattering, half of them denting against the far wall. Kale closed his eyes. "Open them." Activated a skill he'd spent roughly 40 years of accumulated loop time perfecting on a rift, where the only enemies were a mile of identical cardboard targets, a skill that had never once been useful in an actual fight, and that he'd kept anyway, the way you keep an old, oddly specific hobby. Every can he'd marked fell in the same half-second, precise as a metronome. Shia stared at the wreckage, then at him, then, slower, at the wreckage again. "Teach me that," she said, and it wasn't a question. "Deal," Kale said. Welcome to Last Dawn. He offered her a hand, and after a long beat of visible internal argument, she took it. Dinner was already cold and abandoned by the time Kale pushed open the apartment door. A note sat on the table in Mira's handwriting. "Ate without you, don't wait up, don't burn the building down." And he found himself smiling at the absurd, ordinary kindness of a threat like that. He was 3 bites into leftover rice when his phone buzzed. A message from Ling Yu, cold and clipped as ever. She was accepting only to repay a debt. This was temporary, and he should not contact her for anything trivial. He typed back that the assassin's path wasn't suited for her. The reply came almost instantly, colder than the food on his plate. "Don't contact me for trivial reasons." And then the conversation simply ended, the little indicator winking out. Kale sat with that for a moment, chopsticks resting against the bowl. In every version of every timeline he could remember, Ling Yu had been running from the same shadow, a debt, a handler, a life she hadn't chosen. He'd never once, across 3,000 years, managed to get her out before something worse happened. Not this time, he thought, and opened his guild roster. 2 members now, out of 3. Just over 28 hours left on the clock. 2 down, 1 to go, and the clock was getting loud. Rain hit the city an hour past midnight, thin and cold, the kind that turns streetlights into smeared halos. In a narrow alley 6 blocks from the harbor, a boy lay curled against a dumpster, arms over his head, while 4 older boys circled him with the lazy cruelty of people who'd done this so many times it had stopped feeling like anything at all. "Get up," one of them said, nudging him with a boot. "Or are you gonna cry again?" Little Do-yoon, always crying. Do-yoon didn't move. Do-yoon had learned, a long time ago, that moving only made it worse. But something was different tonight. Something under his skin had started to itch. A heat, low and building. The exact wrong-feeling warmth of a bruise about to split open from the inside. He'd felt it before, twice, both times right before something in him he didn't understand had done something he couldn't take back. "Please," he whispered, to no one, to himself, to whatever was crawling up under his ribs. Not again, not again, not again. Red light bled out from his skin like something tearing free. The bullies scattered, screaming, as a shape twisted up out of the light. Huge, wrong, a silhouette built from too many teeth and not enough restraint. It moved before Do-yoon could stop it, and it was fast, and one of the boys who'd been kicking him 30 seconds earlier simply wasn't there anymore. The others ran. The beast gave chase, tearing through a fire escape, through a parked car, through the fragile architecture of an ordinary rainy night, while Do-yoon curled smaller and smaller against the dumpster, sobbing the same 3 words over and over. "Stop, stop, stop." Civilians screamed from windows. Someone shouted that a rookie had lost control of a demon-class monster. A man Do-yoon didn't recognize shook his head at a terrified girl's pleading and admitted, flatly, that he was unranked, powerless against something like this. Then a sound cut through everything, sharp, precise, almost musical, and the creature's glowing eyes snapped toward a figure standing calmly on top of a bent street lamp. Kale watched the creature lunge, watched its claws pass through empty air again and again as he moved with the exact, unhurried precision of a man who had choreographed this fight 900 times before, in 900 versions of a city that no longer technically existed. Onlookers murmured, baffled, that no seasoned Reaper could dodge like this. How was a rookie surviving what trained squads couldn't? He wasn't dodging like a rookie. He was dodging like someone who'd been killed by exactly this shape of monster enough times to know its rhythm in his sleep. When the moment was right, he darted forward, scooped Do-yoon up mid-collapse, and held him tight as the beast towered over them both. "Run!" Do-yoon screamed. "Please, just run! It'll kill you!" "It won't," Kale said, and ordered the shadows to stand down. They did. The red light folded back into Do-yoon's body like smoke drawn back into a bottle, and the boy stared up at him, chest heaving, eyes wide with a specific horror Kale recognized instantly. The horror of a person who has just watched a monster obey a stranger and understood, in the same breath, exactly whose monster it was. "It listened to you," Do-yoon whispered. "It's not separate from you," Kale said gently. "It never was. It's not a monster wearing your skin. It's you." Do-yoon's face crumpled. "The people it's killed, that was me?" "You're an irregular," Kale said, crouching to his level. "Rare." Dangerous, if you never learn to hold it. The more you try to bury it, the harder it fights to get out. But I've watched people like you across more timelines than I can count, Do-yoon. And I'm telling you, you're not the monster. You're the kid who still wants to be a hero even after everything it's cost you. That doesn't go away. Not unless you let it. Do-yoon stared at him for a long, silent moment, rain running down both their faces. Who are you? Someone who's going to teach you control, Kale said. If you'll let me. The boy's chin trembled. Then slowly, he nodded. The guild roster filled itself in the moment they shook on it. 3 out of 3. Registration confirmed. Kale felt something in his chest loosen for the first time in 3,000 years of trying. The training that followed was, by any reasonable measure, excessive. Kale's hacked access to a decommissioned aerospace facility, a favor called in from a version of a debt no one alive remembered him earning, put Shia into zero-gravity resistance drills until she was laughing through exhaustion and calling herself a genius between gasps for air. It put Do-yoon through obstacle courses designed to force 3-minute stretches of control over the thing inside him, minutes that stretched, session by session, painstakingly, towards something that might one day be enough. It put Ling Yu, reluctant, sharp-tongued, insisting the whole time that this changed nothing about her temporary status, through simulated combat scenarios that left her admitting, quietly, that her recovery ability really was the strongest asset on the team. A week bled by in exhausted, floating recovery tanks, and late-night complaints about homework Kale had absolutely no business assigning himself to help with. Somewhere in the middle of it, his sister called to scream at him for covering her hospital shifts without asking, and he let her yell, and he meant every word when he told her he only did it because he had nothing better to do. Because the truth, that he'd spent 3,000 years learning to want nothing but something better to do, was not a truth he knew how to hand her yet. 10 days ticked down to 3, then 1, then hours. On the final night, Kale gathered his 3 members. 3, when the loops had always shown him 7 companions worth saving. 3, when he knew exactly how outmatched they'd be against whatever catastrophe-grade rift the system was about to force on the entire population, and told them the truth as plainly as he could stand to. In a few hours, we get pulled into a random shadow world. Best case, B rank. Realistic case, A rank. Worst case, he paused, choosing the next word with more weight than the sentence deserved. S rank. Shia's easy grin faltered for the first time since he'd met her. Do-yoon went pale. Ling Yu's expression didn't change at all, which was somehow worse. Stay within 50 meters of me, Kale said. Always, no exceptions. I've seen this kind of world before. 3,000 years of seeing it, and I'm telling you now. The only version of tonight where all of us walk out alive is the version where you trust me completely. And if we don't? Ling Yu asked, arms crossed, testing him the way she tested everyone. Kale met her eyes. Then I'll drag you out myself, whether you like it or not. The countdown began ticking on every screen in the city, while 3 people who barely knew each other, and 1 man who'd known versions of them across 3,000 years of dying, stood together in a cracked apartment, bracing for a dawn that had never once, in 900,000 tries, come easy. Kale watched Do-yoon grip the edge of a table until his knuckles went white, watched Shia crack her neck with forced bravado, watched Ling Yu's hand rest, unconsciously, he suspected, near a knife she'd sworn she wouldn't need tonight. I brought you here to protect you, he thought. This time, I mean it. Whatever happens, Kale said quietly, to no one and everyone, I'm bringing all of you home. Light began pooling around all 4 of them, cold and inevitable, the same white-gold glow he remembered from 900,000 mornings that used to reset the second it touched him. The apartment vanished. They materialized above a city split cleanly in half, one side sheeted in ice thick enough to bury entire buildings, the other consumed by a slow, patient wall of fire that ate through streets like it had all the time in the world. Between the two, a visible ring of pale light pulsed and expanded, swallowing more of the city with every heartbeat. What is this place? Do-yoon breathed. Kale stared down at the ruin below, a ruin he'd read about in fragments across 3,000 years of loop rumor and half-verified legend, a rift so infamous that most reapers who'd survived it refused to speak its name twice. The capital of ice and fire, he said. Legend said it wasn't real. Legend was wrong. The dying ring of light kept expanding, patient and merciless. And somewhere at its center, Kale knew, the way he knew the shape of his own scars. Something was waiting that had killed better people than any of them, in every version of every timeline he'd ever managed to glimpse it in. Shia swore under her breath. Ling Yu's hand finally closed around the hilt of her knife. Kale exhaled once, slow, and started walking toward the fire. "Stay close," he said. "This time, we finish it clean." The heat hit them before they'd even cleared the first block, a wall of pressure that made the air shimmer and Do-yoon's breath catch in his throat. "We go through the fire zone," Kale said, already moving. "Not the ice." "Are you insane?" Ling Yu snapped, falling into step anyway, because arguing while walking was apparently more efficient than arguing while standing still. "The ice side is slower, not certain death." "The ice side is certain death," Kale said. "It just takes longer to notice. Cold slows your steps, and slow steps get you killed by anything hunting you. Fire's brutal, but it's honest about what it wants." She didn't answer that, which from Ling Yu was as close to agreement as anyone was going to get. They hadn't gone another 200 meters before the first of them rose out of the ash, figures wrapped in blackened cloth, moving with the jerking, wrong rhythm of things that used to be people, and had long since stopped remembering how walking worked. Mummified husks, fire-warped and fire-hungry, dragging themselves toward the sound of living breath. "Rest," Kale told the others, and drew his blades. "I've got this." He cut through the first three before Shia had even finished raising her hands to help, and when the husks split open under his strikes, small metal chips clattered free from what had once been their chests. Ling Yu crouched, turned one over in her fingers. "Fire deterrent chips?" she said slowly, surprise breaking through her usual flatness. "These aren't natural monsters. Somebody built them. Somebody with a very specific reason to want this city to keep burning," Kale said, though he didn't elaborate. Not yet. Not until he'd confirmed the theory that had been sitting in the back of his mind since the moment they'd landed. "The chips buy safe passage through the flame zone. 3 minutes each." "How do you know that?" Shia asked, not for the first time, and clearly not for the last. "I've read a lot," Kale said, which was true, in the specific, exhausting way that most of his answers to that question were true, and left it there. Do-yoon did the math out loud, voice tight with dawning panic. "The ring expands every 30 minutes. If it collapses after the fourth expansion, that's 2 hours. And you said we need, what, 300 of these chips? For 4 of us to survive that long?" 320, Kale confirmed. "Give or take. That's insane. That's Tuesday," Kale said, and it wasn't really a joke, not for him, and none of them laughed. They fought their way deeper into the burning district as the husks came in growing numbers, each kill yielding another chip, another sliver of borrowed time. Shia's psychic bursts cleared whole clusters at once, crude and effective. Do-yoon kept the red heat under his skin banked low, testing his control in short, controlled bursts that never lasted longer than the 3 minutes Kale had drilled into him back in the simulator pods. Ling Yu moved through the chaos with a brutal, surgical efficiency that made it very clear exactly what kind of training had shaped her before Kale had ever met her. 6 minutes before the ring's next expansion, Do-yoon called out the count. 30 chips still needed, and the husks had thinned to almost nothing. "They're pulling back," Ling Yu said, reading the pattern before anyone else did. "Something's hurting them away from us." Kale didn't hesitate. He pulled a smooth, faintly glowing orb from his coat and hurled it forward, into the heart of the retreating swarm. "Crystal bait," he said. "It'll drag every remaining husk within range straight to us. We finish this before the expansion, or we don't finish it at all." The ground shuddered. Out of the flame came something too large to be another husk, a hulking shape with the body of some ancient predator, and a face that was unmistakably, horribly human, roaring loud enough to rattle the burnt-out windows around them. "That," Ling Yu said, very calmly, in the tone of someone deciding not to panic on principle, "is not a husk." "No," Kale agreed. "That's the last batch of chips arriving all at once. Shia, you're up." She stepped forward without hesitation, focus narrowing, ice-white energy gathering around her hands as she reached out and seized every loose vehicle within 100 meters. Burnt-out cars, a delivery van, a scorched motorcycle, and hurled them down onto the beast in a single, crushing avalanche. The creature staggered under the weight, and Kale was already moving, blade drawn, driving the finishing strike home before it could recover. The system chime that followed felt almost anticlimactic after everything. A soft confirmation, a scatter of loot, a ring of fire-deterrent chips glowing gold on the ground. "We did it," Shia said, breathless, grinning despite everything. "We actually—" Black shapes dropped from the smoke above, cutting her celebration off mid-word. 5 figures in dark mist cloaks landed in a loose circle around them, and their leader stepped forward, with one gloved hand fisted in Ling Yu's collar, a knife already resting against her throat. "Hand over the chips," the man said, "or she doesn't leave this street breathing." "Who are you?" Doyun demanded, voice cracking. "Ashfall," Ling Yu answered instead, teeth gritted, not moving an inch against the blade at her neck. "Top 10 ranked in the underground. Don't provoke them." Kale's expression didn't change. He'd met versions of Ashfall before, in loops where they'd killed him, in loops where he'd killed them first, in loops where they'd simply never crossed paths at all because he'd died too early to matter to anyone. "Fine," he said, and stepped forward, hands raised, palms open. "Take them. All of them. Just let her go first." The leader's eyes narrowed with suspicion, a man who'd survived long enough in his line of work to distrust easy surrender. "Throw them here. Now." Kale counted down under his breath, low enough that only Ling Yu, held rigid against the knife, could possibly hear it, and on 0, he crushed the chip in his own palm instead of throwing it. Light burst outward, and every ally in earshot, Shia, Doyun, Ling Yu, even mid-struggle, crushed their own chips in perfect unison, a wave of pale fireward energy flooding out around them just as the Death Ring's expansion crashed through the district a full breath early. The Ashfall operatives screamed as the fire caught them fully exposed, unprotected, while Kale's team stood untouched inside the flare of their combined wards. Ling Yu twisted free the instant the blade at her throat wavered, driving an elbow into the leader's ribs, hard enough to send him stumbling backward into the flame. "You knew," she said afterward, breathing hard, staring at Kale with something that wasn't quite trust yet, but was no longer quite suspicion either. "You knew the expansion would hit early." "I knew it was close," Kale said. "I've been counting since we landed." She studied him a moment longer, then said quieter, almost to herself, "You marked me. Before any of this, didn't you?" "I marked all of you," Kale admitted. "Before we ever stepped through the gate." She didn't answer that. But she didn't argue it either, and for Ling Yu, that was practically a confession of gratitude. They pushed deeper into the ruined city as the second hour bled away, the Death Ring tightening with every expansion, the buildings around them collapsing under a fire that never seemed to run short of fuel. Doyun asked, more than once, how Kale always seemed to know which direction was safe, and Kale gave him some version of the truth. "I've studied this world longer than you've been alive." That was technically accurate and still somehow left out the important part. It was Shia who spotted the survivors first, a small cluster of Reapers in heat-resistant suits, huddled behind a collapsed overpass, clearly exhausted and clearly out of options. "Should we help them?" Doyun asked. Kale hesitated, a rare enough thing that the others noticed, and then a shadow fell over the ruined street, vast enough to blot out the orange glow of the fire itself. Everyone froze. 3 towering figures rose from the flame-lit haze, humanoid but wrong in every proportion, moving with the slow, unhurried menace of things that had never once needed to be afraid of anything. "Apocalypse Patrol," Kale said, voice dropping low. "Nearly unkillable. If we fight them head-on, we die. All of us." "Then what do we do?" Shia hissed. "I draw them off. You run for the ring's center." Kale was already stepping forward, already putting distance between himself and the others, before any of them could argue. "Absolutely not," Ling Yu snapped. "Not up for debate," Kale said, and when Shia lunged forward to go with him anyway, he caught her wrist and, with more regret than anger, put her down cold, with a precise strike to a nerve cluster she wouldn't feel for another 6 seconds. "Take care of each other," he told the rest of them, already turning toward the giants. "Survival isn't optional." "Not for you," he charged. The fight that followed was less a battle than a controlled, brutal negotiation with death. 3 towering figures, each blow capable of erasing a city block, and Kale weaving between them, with the exhausted, unteachable precision of a man who had survived 900,000 versions of dying in exactly this kind of impossible fight. He baited one giant into a building collapse, landed on its back mid-stagger, cut deep enough to force a stumble, dodged a follow-up strike by less margin than he'd have liked, felt his ribs ache with the near miss, kept moving anyway. He was reaching for a handhold on a crumbling wall, a jump he wasn't going to make, when a hand closed around his wrist and yanked hard enough to dislocate a normal man's shoulder. "Don't let go," Lian said. The survivor from the overpass squad, the one Shia had spotted, hauling him up onto the ledge, with strength that shouldn't have belonged to someone who'd looked half dead 10 minutes earlier. They collapsed together, breathing hard, and Kale stared at her, genuinely startled for the first time since he'd arrived. "Why did you come back for me?" "Because you came for us," Lian said, sharp and a little offended by the question. "I'm not weak. I don't just get sheltered. I fight for the people who matter, and I get fought for in turn. That's how this works." Something in Kale's chest, worn thin by 3,000 years of watching people die to protect him, cracked open in a way that had nothing to do with the battle still raging around them. He didn't get the chance to say anything back. The giants descended again, and he pulled her tight against him and rolled clear of a strike that tore the ledge apart where they'd been standing a half-second earlier. "You're not much help," he told her, breathless, half a laugh buried in the words. "But I appreciate the effort." "Say that again and I'll let the next one hit you," she shot back, flustered, and somewhere behind them, the rest of the team caught up, shouting relief, and immediately, mercilessly, starting to tease them both about the optics of the rescue. The ground shuddered violently. Rubble sealed off the path forward. Behind them, the three giants blocked the only way back. "There's no way out," Doyun said, voice thin with panic. "There is," Kale said, already moving toward a narrow stairwell most of them hadn't even noticed. "Up!" The fortress door recognized his hand the instant he pressed it to the scanner, a holographic key blooming to life. An old, buried piece of the city's dead infrastructure remembering, somehow, that he'd once had clearance here. "How could you possibly know this place exists?" Lian asked, staring around the reinforced control room in disbelief. "He knows everything," Shia said, with the particular exhaustion of someone who'd stopped being surprised by it 2 hours ago. Kale worked the console with practiced hands, mapping the fortress's dormant defense grid back to life while, outside, the three apocalyptic giants closed in on their position. He explained the plan in short, clipped sentences: fog, disorientation, a controlled ambush, and set the others to their positions with the calm authority of a man who had run this exact play, in some approximate shape, more times than he could count. Thick white fog rolled out across the ruined street the moment he gave the signal, swallowing the giants whole, blinding them completely. Kale slipped into the haze and struck from every angle at once, precise and merciless, forcing the towering enemies back step by step. A masked figure emerged from the smoke. The enemy commander Kale had marked hours earlier without any of his team noticing, furious, gripping a weapon crackling with dark, unstable energy. "You'll pay for this ambush," the man snarled, and swung down a scythe-shaped blade in a strike meant to end everything in one motion. A golden barrier flared to life around Kale, absorbing the blow entirely, and the masked commander's eyes went wide with a disbelief that bordered on genuine horror. "Shield of protection," Kale said, calm as ever, already pressing his advantage. "Nullifies anything below level 50. You should have checked my sheet before swinging." His twin blades found their mark before the man could recover, and moments later, with his enemy's grip on the giant's control crystal weakening, Kale reached out and seized command of the Apocalypse Patrol himself. 3 towering, nearly unkillable engines of destruction, suddenly, silently, awaiting his next order. The team stared at him in stunned silence. "I'll handle whatever's waiting at the core alone," Kale said, already turning toward the heart of the death ring. "The rest of you stay here." Lian protested immediately, and Ling Yu's expression darkened, but it was Shia who spoke for all of them in the end. "If our boss says he's coming back," she said, quiet but certain, "then he's coming back." At the heart of the collapsing city, a shattered tower rose out of the wreckage, and from its ruins climbed a figure that had once been human, now fused with machinery in a way that had clearly gone catastrophically, deliberately wrong. His eyes burned with unstable light, and his voice, when it came, carried the flat, furious certainty of something that had stopped considering itself human a long time ago. "Weak mortals," the machine thing roared, "have no right to interrupt my evolution." "Cinder," Kale said, the name he'd pieced together from 3,000 years of fragmented rumor, of a brilliant inventor who'd tried to merge himself with the city's core reactor and lost everything, including his sense of where he ended, and the disaster began. You destroyed this entire city, trying to become something more than human. I'm here to make sure it stops with you. Cinder laughed, a sound like grinding metal, and the fight began in earnest, the Apocalypse Patrol crashing into the tower's foundation on Kale's command, the machine god countering with storms of energy that tore the ruined skyline further apart, the countdown to the Death Ring's final, city-erasing expansion ticking down with a patience that felt almost cruel. Kale's blade found the gap in Cinder's shifting armor on the third exchange, a strike that vibrated at a frequency the machine's defenses hadn't been built to withstand, and for one triumphant second, it looked like enough. Then Cinder's systems roared back online, restoring the damage in seconds, and the countdown on the horizon kept falling. Kale reached into his coat and drew out the only card he had left, a relic he'd carried out of the loop 3 years and 900,000 dawns ago, still faintly warm, still waiting. "Time to hatch," he murmured, and hurled it skyward. The egg split open in a blaze of light, and from it descended something vast and armored, wings of steel unfolding across the burning sky, the steel-winged Colossus, the only thing in 3,000 years of dying that Kale had ever managed to keep. The Colossus struck Cinder head-on, claws tearing into his core, wrenching the unstable power source free in a single violent motion just as the countdown reached its final breath. Silence. The Death Ring stopped expanding. A soft system chime rippled through the wreckage. The final boss had been defeated, and transport would follow in 60 seconds. Kale stood in the ruin, chest heaving, watching the Colossus settle beside him with a low, satisfied hum. A creature that had, somehow, in absorbing Cinder's stolen power, become something far stronger than the machine god it had just killed. The victory's only temporary, he thought, looking out over a city that had nearly killed all 4 of them twice over. Whatever comes next will be worse, and I have to make them stronger before it does. Light gathered around the ruined street, gentle and warm, pulling all 4 of them toward home. For the first time in 3,000 years, Kale's soul let himself believe that this particular dawn, the real one, the one waiting for them on the other side, might actually be worth walking into. The apartment key still worked. Again, the same absurd mundane miracle it had been the first time. Kale stood in the doorway for a long moment before he let himself walk inside, listening to the ordinary hum of the refrigerator, the ordinary silence of a home that had almost, twice now, become a memory instead of a place. Mira wasn't there. A note on the counter, at study group, "Don't wait up, don't burn the building down again," made him laugh, short and surprised. The first real laugh he could remember in longer than made sense to say out loud. He checked his status panel out of habit more than need. Level 30, class still unassigned, level 30. A month ago, he'd been level 9 and invisible. Now he had 3 people who trusted him with their lives. A Colossus sleeping somewhere in a storage dimension he barely understood the mechanics of, and a level that still, didn't come close to reflecting 3,000 years of accumulated knowledge sitting coiled and impatient behind his eyes. He thought about Asher Vale's face on the television, calm and golden and monstrous underneath. He thought about the countdown to whatever came next, always ticking, always closer than it looked. Not fast enough, he thought. I need to be stronger, faster. And I need people around me who can survive what's coming even when I'm not there to catch them. For now, though, for one evening, he let himself just be a brother waiting up for his sister, sitting on the couch with a mug of reheated coffee, doing something he hadn't done in 3,000 years and 900,000 dawns. Nothing at all. Spring came to the city in the ordinary, indifferent way spring always had. Cherry blossoms scattered across sidewalks that had, weeks earlier, been battlegrounds nobody outside the Reaper community had even known about. Valentine's Day crowds filled the streets, couples arguing over restaurant reservations, teenagers taking photos under blossom trees. The whole aching normalcy of a world that had no idea how close it had come to losing an entire city to fire and ice. Kale sat alone on a bench near the harbor, sun warm on his face, savoring an unfamiliar and slightly guilty pleasure, doing nothing, being no one important, just a guy in the sun while the world went on without needing him for a few hours. A young couple nearby noticed him and laughed, not unkindly. "Look at that guy," the boy said to his date, grinning. "All alone on Valentine's Day. Rough." Kale let it slide off him. 3,000 years gave a person a fairly high threshold for being laughed at by strangers who had no idea what he'd survived. Then a murmur rippled through the crowd, a specific electric shift in attention, and heads turned in unison toward a woman walking down the promenade like the crowd itself was rearranging around her without needing to be asked. Anna Reyes, CEO of Virion Biotech, 26 years old, and, Kale knew from 3,000 years of fragmented, half-remembered timelines, the kind of brilliant that made most people uncomfortable to be near for very long. She walked straight up to him and held out a paper cup. "Coffee," she said, "before it gets cold." He raised an eyebrow. "We know each other in this timeline?" She frowned slightly at the odd phrasing, but let it pass. "You saved my life in the capital of ice and fire. The lightning-charged item you gave me during the extraction. Turns out it was priceless. I looked into it. So, this makes us even. Don't read into it." He took the coffee, hid a small smile behind the cup. It was a modified C-rank knuckle guard. "You're overpaying on the debt math." "I don't do the math," she said, sitting down beside him uninvited, arms crossed with the particular defensiveness of someone who very much did do the math, obsessively, all the time. "I do the results, and the result is, I owe you. I settle my debts." Around them, the crowd whispered, some mocking the sight of a legendary CEO sitting with a nobody in worn clothes, some arguing that she was simply repaying a kindness. Kale ignored all of it, the way he'd learned to ignore whispers 3,000 years before any of these particular whisperers had been born. "You're staring," Anna said, not looking at him. "You have very specific taste in undergarment colors, apparently," Kale said mildly, nodding at a barely visible strap under her collar. Her face went scarlet in half a second flat. "Shameless," she hissed, and shoved his shoulder hard enough to nearly spill both their coffees, and stormed off in a fury that didn't quite manage to hide the small, reluctant smile tugging at the corner of her mouth as she went. Some things really don't change, Kale thought, watching her go. Not across any version of this that I've ever seen. The Reaper Exchange Center occupied the top 6 floors of a glass tower that had somehow survived every rift-adjacent disaster the city had thrown at it. A marketplace where relics pulled from shadow worlds changed hands for sums that would have bankrupted small nations before the rifts opened. Kale walked in flanked by Anna, reluctantly dragged along, still muttering about her wasted afternoon, and immediately made a beeline for a vendor's stall selling a small, unassuming cube. "Ancient mechanical puzzle," the vendor said. A cyborg with a salesman's smile stretched a fraction too wide. "A rank at least. National experts have tried and failed to crack it. I'll let it go for 90,000, and if you solve it in one attempt, it's yours free." Kale turned the cube over once, twice, and solved it in under 8 seconds. The cube split open with a soft mechanical sigh, revealing a glowing key inside, and the vendor's expression collapsed from smug to horrified in the space of a single breath. That's a Shadow World treasury key. That's worth..." He lunged for it. "I can't give that away for 1,000 coins. There's been a mistake." "There's no mistake," Kale said, calm and immovable. "You quoted the deal. Goddess Luo." He tilted his head toward Anna, who blinked, startled by the borrowed title, but too proud to correct it in front of a crowd already watching. "Is my patron today. Her word is worth more than your license." The vendor paled and backed off, muttering apologies, while Anna shot Kale a look that promised retribution later, and said nothing to contradict him in the moment. They moved through the marketplace for another hour, Kale picking out item after item with the unerring instinct of a man who'd spent 3,000 years learning exactly which Shadow World relics carried hidden properties invisible to ordinary scanners. A dagger that melted its wielder into shadow for a second and a half, a cloak that let its wearer see spirits, a crystalline shard that could substitute for a rare advancement material. Anna paid for all of it, complaining the entire time, calling him a heartless capitalist exploiting her generosity, and paying for the next item anyway. By the time he stood on the raised platform to auction Anna's private collection, items she'd never actually owned until an hour earlier, a crowd of guild leaders and vice leaders had gathered, drawn by whispered rumors of a mysterious backer. "This dagger," Kale announced, holding up the first item, "appears to be worthless B-grade trash." Laughter rippled through the hall. Someone shouted that he was wasting everyone's time. Kale vanished from the stage mid-sentence and reappeared behind a mocking bidder in the front row, blade resting lightly against the man's throat. Gone again before the crowd had fully processed the movement. Hidden ability, Kale said, back on the stage as if nothing had happened. Melts the wielder into shadow for 1.5 seconds, 6 times per battle. I'll start the bidding at 200,000. The room erupted. Bids climbed in a frenzy. 200, 500, 800,000, until the hammer finally fell at 5 million coins, and the crowd that had laughed at him minutes earlier now stared with an entirely different kind of attention. Item after item followed the same pattern. Dismissed as junk, revealed as treasure, sold for sums that turned a modest afternoon of shopping into a fortune large enough to fund a guild for years. By the final lot, an enchanted ring paired with a rare recovery potion, 3 separate guild leaders were locked in an increasingly desperate bidding war, driving the price into the tens of millions before a calm, commanding voice from the back of the hall cut through the chaos entirely. 75 million, the voice said. Uncontested. The hall went silent. Every head turned toward a figure who hadn't been there a moment before. A colossal, shimmering projection filling the back third of the room. A man whose face the entire world had memorized from 1,000 hero broadcasts. Asher Vale. Kale's expression didn't change, though something cold settled into his chest. The exact specific chill of watching a monster smile from 3,000 years of memory made suddenly, terribly present. Forgive the interruption, Asher said, voice warm, projected across the hall like a benediction. I have a question for the man on that stage. The crowd murmured his title, Warden, Guildmaster, Savior, with the kind of reverence Kale had spent 3,000 years learning to see straight through. Have we met before? Asher asked, gaze fixed directly on Kale. Something about you feels familiar. Black Ruin City, perhaps? He remembers, Kale thought, forcing his expression to stay neutral through sheer force of will. Some fragment of a loop he shouldn't be able to remember at all. I don't believe we have, Kale said evenly. I'd remember. Asher's smile stretched, just slightly too wide, just slightly too long. Curious, he said. I could have sworn. The projection reached out, an impossible gesture for a hologram, and yet Kale felt something press against the air near his hand, cold and pointed, like a hand offered in greeting that was actually a blade held very, very still. I'll be watching your progress with interest, Asher said, pleasant as ever, terrifying underneath it in a way the rest of the hall had no idea to be afraid of. Do visit ARC sometime. I do so enjoy meeting promising young talents. The projection dissolved as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving the auction hall in stunned, whispering silence. Anna leaned close to Kale, voice low. You know him, she said. It wasn't a question. I know exactly what he is, Kale said quietly, watching the space where the projection had been like it might reform at any second. And now, apparently, he's starting to remember what I am too. The nightmare found him 3 nights later, the same way it had found him every night since the auction. Asher's grin stretched too wide, crimson lightning splitting a collapsing building in half. A voice thundering everything must be destroyed while Kale's own hands failed, again and again, to stop what was coming. He woke drenched in sweat, hand pressed to his chest, the phantom ache of a blow that had never actually landed in this timeline pulsing beneath his ribs anyway. 3,000 years of dying, he thought, staring at the ceiling in the dark, and somehow this is the dream that won't let me sleep. He got up, walked to his desk, opened the case holding the 2 relics he'd pulled from the auction's chaos, a charging device and a small, faintly glowing crystal shard he'd deliberately kept back from Anna's collection, recognizing its true nature the instant he'd first touched it. The shard could replicate any S-grade item he'd ever used, which meant, in the right circumstances, it could replicate power he hadn't yet earned but had, across 3,000 years, watched other people wield. He turned it over once in his fingers, thinking about Asher Vale's smile, thinking about the gap between what he knew and what his level allowed him to actually do, and made a decision that had been building since the moment that golden projection had reached toward him in the auction hall. Level 30 isn't enough. I need a class, a real one. And I know exactly where to find one. He pulled up an old, half-verified rumor from 3,000 years of fragmented loop knowledge. A tower, a sage, a trial that offered hidden classes to those willing to risk complete obliteration for the chance. He'd never once, in 900,000 dawns, survived long enough to reach it. This time, he had a guild behind him. This time, He had reasons that mattered more than survival. He sent a single message to the group. Pack light. They were heading to the Sage Tower. 3 replies came back within minutes. Shia's was eager, almost gleeful, practically vibrating with excitement at the thought of something new to break. Ling Yu's was colder, sharper, reminding him, again, not to contact her for trivial reasons. Doyun's was the shortest of the 3, and somehow the heaviest. Just one question. Was it dangerous? Kale typed back the same answer to all 3, honest for once instead of reassuring. Extremely dangerous. Bring everything you have. He set the phone down, looked out the window at a city that had no idea how close it had come to burning twice, and thought about Asher Vale's voice echoing across the auction hall. Do visit Ark sometime, and about the version of himself who had died in that man's shadow 900,000 times before ever learning how to fight back. Not this time, he thought again. The same promise he'd made to himself the very first morning he'd woken up free. This time, I'm not running out of chances before I've even used the ones I've got. Somewhere across the city, unseen, a hidden gate deep beneath an old ruined estate flickered faintly to life, waiting, patient, for a man who'd spent 3,000 years learning exactly how to survive the impossible to finally come and claim what it had been guarding. Dawn was still hours away. For the first time in 3,000 years, Kale's soul wasn't dreading it. He was racing toward it,